For those of you who don't know me, my name is Paddy Kelly, and I have the privilege of being the director of the Children's Law Centre. On behalf of the Children's Law Centre and Youth at CLC, I'd like to welcome you all here this morning. Just housekeeping. I don't think there's any fire drill planned this morning, so if there's any alarm goes off, there are two fire exits. This one at the top and the one that you probably came through. There might actually be one on the other side of that as well, but so obviously you can exit via those doors and follow any advice that the staff give you. I would ask you to turn your mobile phones to silent. I'm not asking you to turn them off because I really would welcome you engaging on social media about today's event. The event isn't being streamed live, but we will be recording it and will be available to attendees later. I would like to extend a particular welcome to our political representatives who are here today, and I'm delighted to see so many of you in the room. In particular, I'd like to welcome and thank our sponsoring MLAs, Danny Baker, Robbie Butler, Diane Forsyth, Cara Hunter and Shane Mulholland. Excuse me. I'd also like to welcome representative duty bearer organisations here with us today, from Northern Ireland Government departments, relevant arm's length bodies and non-departmental public bodies. I'd like to very warmly welcome representatives from civil society, colleagues from children's charities, academics, the community and voluntary sector and human rights NGOs. I want to particularly thank these colleagues because it was the information, the wealth of information they gave us that informed the three substantial reports that the Children's Law Centre submitted on their behalf to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And a very special welcome to the young people who are with us today. Delighted you could be here. There was a child-specific event about a month ago, so we had over 100 young people at that. But I'm delighted some of those young people could be with us today and reflect back on the messages that those young people said loudly and clearly in the University of Ulster. I'm not, because we've started a little bit late, I'm not going to go through the actual running schedule, but it is in your packs, so you'll have that available to you. Before I invite our lead sponsor, Danny Baker, to say a few words of welcome, I would like to share some personal reflections today. I have attended every examination of the UK government by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child since the first examination way back in 1994, 1995. And in that series of examinations, this year's constructive dialogue, as the committee is now calling it, was the best of times and the worst of times. It was best because of the young people who attended and gave voice to all the other young people in this jurisdiction, representing over 1,000 young people who informed their report and engagement with the committee. They were powerful, passionate, fearless in speaking truth to power, despite the personal cost, and in holding duty bearers to account. They spoke with the authority that comes from lived experience and shared selflessly of that experience. I learnt a lot from them during those visits to Geneva, and the strength of the concluding observations and their specificity to this jurisdiction speaks to the impact of their witness in Geneva. On behalf of all of us, I want to publicly recognise and thank them. The examination was also, in my experience of the UN Committee's examinations, the worst of times. And that is evidenced in the damning concluding observations that Deena will reflect on in more detail. We have and are abysmally failing our children and young people. We are still raising issues that we raised 29 years ago. We have reoccurring observations and recommendations that were made in 1995, when many in this room were still children, and they were raised in every subsequent examination. The children of 1995 are now parents facing the same denial of their children's rights that they faced as children, only now it's worse. The recommendations paint the grim picture facing children and young people in this jurisdiction today. Some major recommendations like raising the age of criminal responsibility, legislation to protect under 18s from age discrimination, ending the use of plastic bullets against children, and the introduction of a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland have been outstanding for years and have been included in successive concluding observations. Other recommendations, like scrapping the Northern Ireland budget, ending PSNI strip searches of children, and ending the use of contingency accommodation for asylum-seeking children, are new and add to a growing list of serious children's rights breaches. The reporting process has told us that the gap of children's rights has grown significantly over the last decade, and children and young people are suffering every day because of it, whether it's facing discrimination, homelessness, failure to access critical services such as medical health services and education, or not being allowed to have a say on decisions affecting them. We are witnessing that growing gap every day on the Children's Law Centre's advice line. Our colleagues, some of whom have been supporting young people and their families for over 20 years, say they have never experienced the level and severity of need as is now presenting on a daily basis. The scale of non-compliance with children's rights obligations is alarming. We are living in the perfect storm. The legacy of Brexit, the long-term impact of COVID on children and young people, the cost of living crisis, the absence of accountable, locally elected government who care about our children and who understand what they're facing, and the impact of a punishment budget. The convergence is currently and will further hollow out children's rights. The people who can end the regression and change the lives of our children are in this room. We all need to listen to our young people and act urgently to address the many failings identified throughout the examination process and in the committee's concluding observations. We owe it to all the young people who went to Geneva and all children and young people in this jurisdiction whose lives are being negatively impacted by our collective failings. 29 years on from the first examination process, there can be no more excuses and no further delays. I would now like to invite our lead sponsor, Danny Baker, to say a few words. Danny is a Sinn Féin MLA for West Belfast. He's a former Lord Mayor of Belfast, having represented the Collin District electoral area in Belfast City Council until his election to the Northern Ireland Assembly, and since March 23 has been Sinn Féin spokesperson for children and young people and the community and voluntary sector. Danny also chairs the all-party group on children and young people. And Danny, and I know it's probably not polite to talk about a gentleman's age, but I think I'm right that you were still a child at the time of the first examination of the UK government by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And I think if you go back now as an MLA and have a look, you will be deeply concerned at how many of the recommendations made in 1995 when you were still a child are still outstanding in 2023. Danny.
Paddy, and yes, I'm getting on a wee bit these days. So, Maji Moya Karja, you're all very welcome to today's briefing. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Paddy, Fergal from the Law Centre, and Chris Quinn, our Children's Commissioner, all organisations in attendance, and all the MLAs right across the spectrum, but most importantly, our young people who are with us today. A huge gourmet amount to the Children's Law Centre for organising today's briefing on the rights of a child following the UN Committee recommendations. As legislators, MLAs value the help and support of such bodies, the Children's Commissioner's Office, the Human Rights Commission, Children's Law Centre, and many other voluntary community groups and NGOs. The Children's Law Centre must be congratulated for coordinating a submission to the United Nations Monitoring Committee on the rights of the child and providing this briefing on the committee's recommendations with a view of progressing those recommendations. As you know, rights work in different ways. They can act as safeguarding mechanism where childhood is a protected status or as emergent rights, a process of legalised coming of age, or as active rights with children as individual holders. Rights aren't just a given, they are also embedded in practice. Developing processes of meaningful access and participation of children and young people are also crucial to the realisation of those rights. And that's why an establishment of a youth assembly and other forums to facilitate inclusive dialogue are very welcome. The realisation of rights upon the voices of children and young people not only being heard but also being heeded. Children's rights are cross-cutting, cross-departmental and involve many institutions and providers. The Children's Cooperation Act provides an opportunity for different departments and service providers to work together. I particularly noted the UN Committee's concerns about data collection, and if you know a problem well, you're halfway to addressing it. The use of impact assessments can provide sound guidance to policymakers and legislators. Whether on the basis of children's rights, rural needs, or the Good Friday Agreement's equality measures, impact assessments should be the bedrock of policy development. The Good Friday Agreement remains a foundational document, not least in its promise of progressive change and for our children and young people a pathway to a better future. Today we are considering another foundational document, but we do so at a time of difficulty, a combination of imposed cuts that are impacting the most vulnerable in our society the most, Brexit, wanton mismanagement by the British government, and no executive or assembly has fuelled that difficulty. Many children and young people and their families are facing increasing difficulties, greater poverty, higher levels of anxiety and depression, and more lost opportunities. Ask the child worried about the cost of their school uniform, or the young person waiting too long for a medical appointment. Ask the child with special educational needs without a proper placement, or the youth subjected to stop and search, or a teenager facing sexual harassment or cyberbullying. Ask newcomer children, unaccompanied asylum seekers, children from the traveller community and other marginalised groups. Young people can constantly tell us the same thing, that they want a future, an inclusive, tolerant future, a future in a sustainable environment and progressive change to better their lives. And just on a very personal, myself, and I always call myself an accidental politician, I really did become a political representative because of the children and young people in my community. A number of years ago, a lot of them felt they weren't a part of society. We were facing very difficult times. And that was a real worry, that they didn't feel that they were part of a community. And what they wanted was that voice. They wanted someone to listen to them, listen to what their concerns were and fight for them. And that's why I agreed to go into politics, first as a Belfast City Councillor, and was very lucky to be the Mayor of Belfast because I got to meet groups, the community and voluntary sector, many different young people, whether it was from the Shankill Road, East Belfast, the Falls, or Twinbrook. They're all saying the same thing and they're all facing the same difficulties. We have an onus on us. I am very privileged to be a member of the Legislative Assembly, but I have a job to do. I know the onus is on me and all the MLAs here today to make that better future, because the clock is ticking. There's no getting away from it. Every day when I meet, especially in the youth sector of it, I'm very close and volunteer with many of the youth providers, and we are losing expertise every single day, and that's to do with the brutal cuts that have been coming our way. It is unfair how these cuts are coming, and if we don't act now, we know it will impact our children's future. I don't know what the future holds for me, but I do know that if we don't act now, working together, then we're going to impact our futures, and we need to do something about it. So, folks, I'm not going to speak any longer. I'm going to hand it over to the experts, and I really thank you for your time. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I want to add to both Paddy and Danny's warm welcome. We're delighted to see so many people here this morning. My name is Fergal McFerran. I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the Children's Law Centre. And my job this morning, before we hear from Dr. Deena Haydon for a more detailed analysis of the UN Committee's concluding observations and recommendations, is to provide a brief overview of the process that's actually brought us to this point where we have such a detailed report from the committee. Recognising that we have managed to bring together such a varied mix of people and organisations today, which is really very encouraging, we do realise, however, that there will be an equally varied level of understanding in the room of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So before I speak to the process, I'm going to very briefly talk about the Convention itself as well as the role of the Committee of the Rights of the Child. So to get started, I'm going to briefly cover some key aspects of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, often referred to as the UNCRC. The Convention is an international human rights treaty, the most ratified human rights treaty in history. In fact, only one state is missing in order to reach universal ratification, and there will be extra treats at lunch for anyone who can guess who that is. It is regarded and accepted as the authoritative description of the basic rights every child is entitled to and should expect to enjoy. In our view, it is the floor through which a society should not fall, rather than a ceiling on our ambitions for children's rights. It was ratified by the UK in 1991. The Convention contains 54 articles, which outline rights in respect of all aspects of the lives of children and young people, as well as how government and others should work to make sure those rights are realised. There are 4 general principles in the Convention. These are meant to help the interpretation of the Convention as a whole and thereby guide how governments and others implement it. They are Article 2, the principle of non-discrimination, Article 3, the best interests of the child, Article 6, the right to life, survival and development, and Article 12, the views of the child. So now briefly on to the committee itself. Every state which has ratified the Convention has accepted a duty to report to the treaty body responsible for overseeing its implementation. That is the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. The committee is a body of 18 independent children's rights experts who meet formally for a period of weeks 3 times a year at the office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. The current iteration of the committee includes lawyers, academics, NGO leaders, senior officials from public and government agencies around the world, all engaged in particular areas of law, policy and practice, and its interaction with children and young people. They are the authority on the Convention today. So what does the process look like that has brought us here today? I'm going to try to explain what this kind of messy thing on the screen looks like. Well, in March 2021, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child sent the state party, in this case the UK government, a request for specific information known as the list of issues prior to reporting. Before the list of issues prior to reporting was issued, the committee cooperated with a range of non-governmental stakeholders who submitted written reports on the situation in relation to children's rights. These can be NGOs, national human rights institutions, children's own organisations and others, including academics, researchers and civil society organisations. From a Northern Ireland perspective, the Children's Law Centre coordinated the response from the Northern Ireland NGO sector, while Nikki, the Children's Commissioner for Northern Ireland, fed into the UK-wide report from all Children's Commissioners, and other organisations also provided input, including the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. The reports identified emerging trends and highlighted key issues to be included in the list of issues provided by the committee to the state, and the UK government then, with input from the devolved administrations, formally responded to the committee's list of issues by submitting what's referred to as the State Party Report in June 2022. When the State Party's report was received, stakeholders could submit reports or comments on that report, as well as questions for the constructive dialogue, previously known and sometimes in CLC still as the examination, which takes place in the later stages of the process where the committee questions a delegation from the state. And for those in the room who attended that delegation on behalf of Northern Ireland, I'm sure probably felt it was more like an examination than a constructive dialogue. Again, CLC coordinated the submission of reports on behalf of the Northern Ireland NGO sector in December 2022, as well as a significant amount of work by young people to submit a comprehensive children and young people's report. We too worked in partnership with colleagues in the children's rights sectors in England, Scotland and Wales to submit joint material to the committee on issues of shared concern. All of these efforts were complemented by submissions of further evidence by children's commissioners, human rights institutions and other NGOs. All of this information was used to aid the committee's deliberations, the next phase of which being their pre-session, which took place in February of this year. This is where the committee invited children's organisations and selected stakeholders to participate in what's referred to as the pre-sessional working group, to hold an in-depth discussion on their submissions. CLC attended the pre-session in Geneva, answering questions alongside colleagues from the Children's Commissioner as well as the Northern Ireland Youth Forum, and most importantly, facilitating the attendance of children and young people to engage directly with committee members to make their voice heard. Following that pre-session, in May of this year, the committee then met formally with a delegation representing the UK state, including representatives of the devolved administrations, where over 2 days they asked questions based on the significant amount of evidence they had received and considered. This is referred to as the constructive dialogue. We were particularly pleased that immediately before the pre-session began in May, the committee's task force for the UK set aside time to meet again with a delegation of young people in which Northern Ireland was more than well represented. And that takes us to where we are now. Following the committee's constructive dialogue in May, they prepared, drafted and published their concluding observations and recommendations to the UK in June of this year. After months, in fact years of gathering evidence, discussion, exchange of views and deliberation, the committee have reached their conclusions about the state of children's rights in the UK today. And they are concerned. And that's what we are here today to consider. And so now, for a more detailed analysis of that, I'm pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Deena Haydon. Deena is an independent policy and research consultant. She is a trusted friend of the Children's Law Centre and I know will be well known in this room today. She is the editor of the most recent NGO submissions to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, but her experience and knowledge in this area is much more extensive and wide-ranging than that. And I would ask you to please give a warm welcome to Dr. Deena Haydon.
Morning, everyone. As Fergal mentioned, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1989 and it was signed by the UK government in April 1990, ratified in December 91 and came into force over 30 years ago in January 1992. Since then, the State Party has submitted 5 periodic reports to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. And the latest 6th and 7th combined reports were submitted in July 2016, and the concluding observations were in June 2023. Along with many people in the room, not quite as much as Paddy, but I've been involved in this process of reporting to the committee for quite some time. So in 2006, I was commissioned by the then Children and Young People's Unit to consult with so-called hard-to-reach children and young people across Northern Ireland to inform the Northern Ireland element of the 2007 State Party report. And then I was commissioned by Save the Children and the Children's Law Centre to build on the work carried out by Sarah Boyce and write the Northern Ireland NGO Alternative Report submitted to the committee in March 2008. With colleagues from Northern Ireland and other jurisdictions, I attended and presented to the pre-sessional meeting with the committee in June of that year, and then submitted additional information and observed the government examination in October 2008. So I've been involved since then. In the latest cycle, I was commissioned by the Children's Law Centre to work with youth at CLC to develop an online survey for 12 to 7-year-olds and workshops with the most disadvantaged and vulnerable groups as a basis for writing the Rights Here, Rights Now Children and Young People's report that was submitted to the committee in December last year. I also gathered and analysed information from NGOs who work with children and young people to write the Northern Ireland NGO Stakeholder Report and supporting evidence that was submitted to the committee in December. So, I've got many years of involvement and these have informed my reflections today. So the examination of the state party by the committee is intended to be, as Fergal said, a constructive dialogue. The committee's concluding observations note progress, concerns, and associated recommendations under themes or clusters of rights. These include general measures of implementation, the kind of structures and processes that have been put in place to make sure children's rights are promoted and protected in a society. Definition of the child, and the Convention doesn't make a distinction between children and young people. It considers all those under 18 to be children who should receive the provisions and protections outlined in the Convention. It includes the general principles, as Fergal said, of non-discrimination, best interests of the child as a primary consideration in all matters concerning children, the right to life, survival and development, and respect for the views of the child. Another cluster is civil rights and freedoms, which are often not associated with children, but actually include really important issues affecting them both as individuals and as a collective group, including the rights to nationality, identity, freedom of expression and religion, freedom of association and peaceful assembly, the right to privacy and to access appropriate information. Violence against children is a theme that was recently developed to bring together the different forms of violence perpetrated against children in their families, communities and state institutions such as schools, healthcare settings, residential care and custody. The family environment and alternative care includes issues relating to childcare, support for parents and carers, support for young carers who are looking after their parents and siblings in their families, support for children and young people in and leaving care, including secure care, and the children of incarcerated parents. Children with disabilities were previously considered under basic health and welfare, and now there's a separate cluster of rights that includes issues around their impact of welfare changes, systems for the early detection and intervention to facilitate access of children with all types of disability to education, healthcare, social protection and support. Basic health and welfare includes access to health services, mental health, adolescent health, particularly relationship and sex education and the prevention of substance misuse, environmental health and the standard of living. Education, leisure and cultural activities focuses on inequalities in educational attainment and outcomes for children in disadvantaged situations. Inclusive education in mainstream schools for children with disabilities or special needs, school exclusion, discrimination and bullying, teaching about children's rights, responses to violence in schools, practices that contribute to high levels of stress for children, including academic selection and testing, and children's right to play. And finally, special protection measures focus on particular groups who require additional protections, including asylum-seeking refugee and migrant children, children without a regular residence status, children who are trafficked, and the administration of child justice, so children and young people who are in conflict with the law. So the concluding observations, what do they include? They look at progress, so the measures that have been put in place to improve implementation of the Convention. This includes any ratification of treaties or conventions by the state party, for example, the Council of Europe Convention on the Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse in 2018. It includes the implementation of specific legislation, policy or measures, for example, in Northern Ireland, the introduction of the 2020 to 23 Children and Young People's Strategy. It includes provision of information, the large amount of information that's available about children's rights, or on regulations concerning use of electrical discharge weapons and pain-inducing techniques. It includes the establishment of relevant bodies, such as the Children's Commissioners in each jurisdiction, and establishment of the Northern Ireland Youth Assembly here. And it includes provision of services, for example, the various childcare services provided by the state. So the concluding observations do recognise progress that has been made by states, but it particularly focuses on the committee's concerns. And they relate to, for example, lack of protection. So 16 and 17-year-olds, for example, don't always receive protection as children, with marriage under 18 years of age remaining permissible in Scotland and Northern Ireland. insufficient progress in ensuring the protection of all under 18s against discrimination on the grounds of their age, and children experiencing discrimination, bullying or harassment in relation to their sexual orientation or gender identity. It focuses on persistent issues, for example, discrimination against particular groups, or the persistent use of unreliable methods for determining the age of child asylum seekers, and limited progress in bringing the child justice system in line with the UNCRC. They focus on lack of systemic application of the Convention's principles of non-discrimination, best interests and participation. They also highlight inequalities, for example, health and education inequalities for children in disadvantaged situations. They draw out the effect of specific measures or legislation, such as the Public Order Act 2023 in England and Wales, on a right of children to freedom of association and peaceful assembly, and the committee were most concerned about the illegal migration bill, which includes a ban on the right to claim asylum, allows for the prolonged detention and removal of children, and creates barriers for acquiring nationality. The concerns focus on use of particular interventions, so as Paddy mentioned, the unnecessary stop and search checks on children by the police, use of harmful devices, including spit hoods, plastic bullets, taser guns, strip searches, solitary confinement or isolation or seclusion and restraint as disciplinary measures in schools, alternative care and healthcare settings. They focus on the high prevalence of particular issues, for example, domestic abuse and sexual exploitation, gender-based violence and other forms of violence against children. Concerns also are raised around the large numbers of children experiencing particular issues, such as being placed in alternative care, or those with mental health issues, learning disabilities and autism being placed in detention and adult psychiatric wards under mental health legislation. Those who live in areas with unsafe levels of air pollution and toxic air, those living in poverty, those experiencing food insecurity and homelessness. The concerns focus on insufficient measures, for example, to investigate domestic abuse or sexual exploitation, to identify and support children at risk of violence in their homes, or to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Inadequate resources, for example, allocated to children who are victims of violence, and the long waiting list for children seeking mental health services. And they focus on insufficient support services, for example, for children living in and leaving alternative care. So you can see the concerns cover a really broad spectrum of issues affecting children and young people. So their recommendations link to these concerns, and they're addressed to the government of the UK of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So that includes England, the governments of devolved administrations in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland where relevant, also the overseas territories and the Crown dependencies. And the recommendations focus on detailed actions that the government or devolved administrations are urged to undertake in relation to reviewing, developing and adopting legislation, specific policies, programmes, campaigns, action plans and guidance. They focus on conducting investigations or independent inquiries into specific issues, or implementing the recommendations of relevant inquiries and reviews and investigations, which often doesn't happen. We have a lot of independent reviews and they come up with fantastic recommendations which are then not implemented, but also implementing previous committee recommendations. They focus on providing particular interventions, services or support, training and capacity building for professionals, as well as information and education for children, collecting and analysing disaggregated data around particular groups or issues. It was surprising, there's a lot of data that is collected, but there also is information about specific groups that isn't disaggregated in a way that allows us to see how things are affecting particular groups of children and young people, or those of a particular age, or particular ethnicity or gender. They also focus on allocating sufficient resources, including funding, monitoring, assessing and evaluating the impact of particular policies and activities, and prohibiting, halting or stopping specific practices and repealing particular legal provisions. So they're quite detailed about what needs to happen to ensure that children's rights are implemented. And in this set of concluding observations in particular, I think they're a really comprehensive overview of the issues and the recommendations that need to be acted on across all the jurisdictions of the UK. Having reminded the state party of the indivisibility, can never say that word, and interdependence of all the rights in the Convention, at the start of its latest concluding observations, the committee drew attention to recommendations concerning areas that it says require urgent measures. This includes non-discrimination, abuse, neglect, sexual exploitation and abuse, children deprived of a family environment, mental health, asylum-seeking refugee and migrant children, and the administration of child justice. So they're the areas that the committee has drawn out as particularly requiring urgent attention. Identifying lack of progress on ongoing violation of children's rights, as Paddy mentioned, the committee's observations always refer back to previous observations that have not been followed through. So it says, recalling its previous recommendations, the committee recommends, and then it makes a list of recommendations. As Paddy said as well, unfortunately, there's been lack of progress in many areas, and to just give you some examples. Under general measures of implementation, in terms of coordination, the committee recommended that the state party should establish structures such as a ministerial lead at the national level, which we don't have here, with corresponding structures in the devolved administrations, who's responsible for ensuring the effective monitoring and coordination of all activities relating to implementation of the Convention across all sectors and at all levels. In terms of general principles, the committee said that they were very concerned about persistent discrimination through expressions of racism and bullying against children in disadvantaged situations, and insufficient progress having been made ensuring protection of all children under 18 against discrimination on the grounds of their age, as well as over-representation of specific groups in the criminal justice system. And they also noted with concern that the principle of the best interests of the child is not systematically applied in all matters affecting children. In terms of civil rights and freedoms, they were deeply concerned about what they called the chilling effect of counter-terrorism measures on the right of children to freedom of expression. And recalling previous recommendations, they urged the state party to guarantee the right of all children to freedom of expression and to practice freely their religion or belief. They noted restrictions on children's right to freedom of association and peaceful assembly through use of acoustic devices, what are called mosquito devices, to disperse gatherings of children. They emit a very high-pitched sound that is only heard by children, and they're used in public spaces to try and discourage children from gathering in public spaces. In relation to the right to privacy, it recalled previous recommendations about continued use of unnecessary stop and search checks on England, and the fact that the majority of these are conducted on children belonging to ethnic minority groups, especially in England. In relation to violence against children, when considering torture and cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, the committee remained deeply concerned about the large number of children who continue to experience use of electrical discharge weapons, pain-inducing techniques and seclusion, particularly children belonging to ethnic minority groups and children with disabilities. And they remain concerned about continued use of corporal punishment in the home and the legal defence of reasonable punishment in England and Northern Ireland. In addition to a range of other issues around education, the committee was concerned about overuse of exclusion from school, including informal exclusions and off-rolling. And they recommended that the state party ensures the right of children to appeal their exclusion and provide them with legal advice and representation where appropriate. And in terms of special protections around specific groups, talking about the administration of child justice, the committee stated it's deeply concerned about the draconian and punitive nature of the state party's child justice system, and the limited progress being made in implementing the committee's previous recommendations to bring the child justice system in line with the Convention. While many of the recommendations in the concluding observations are generic and they apply across the different UK jurisdictions, some are Northern Ireland specific. So they made a number of recommendations, including enacting a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland, withdrawing the 2023-24 budget for Northern Ireland and fully considering the equality and human rights implications for a new budget, revising the religious education syllabus to include education on and respect for a diversity of religions, prohibiting the non-statutory stop and search checks against children, strengthening the implementation of legislation protecting children from abuse of trust in all environments and all extracurricular activities, strengthening measures to protect children from intimidation, racist attacks and other forms of violence committed by non-state actors, including so-called paramilitary organisations, and from recruitment by such actors into violent activities, establishing a childcare strategy and ensuring that all children in socio-economically disadvantaged situations have access to free childcare, and ensuring access for adolescent girls to age-appropriate family planning services, affordable contraceptives, a safe abortion and post-abortion care services, with a view to ensuring that no adolescent girl has to travel to other jurisdictions of the state party to access reproductive health care. So those are the kinds of things that have already been recommended in previous recommendations, and the committee is restating that these need to be followed through, and specific recommendations for Northern Ireland. So reflecting on this process and what the benefits of it, I guess, to start with, I was thinking about, having been involved in this for quite a long time, there are some limitations to the process. And to me, these are quite basic. So, for example, in the State Party report and in responses to questions during examination by the committee, UK government representatives tend to just list the policies or strategies or programmes that have been introduced and the amount of funding that's allocated to them, with very little analysis of whether those policies or strategies or programmes have actually made any impact for children and young people, whether they've actually led to positive differences in their lives or realisation of their rights for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. During the examination, government representatives generally read prepared statements rather than respond directly to committee questions. So it's not so much a dialogue as we're going to just tell you what we've done. And their responses to committee members' questions tend to refute criticism. So they say, no, we don't agree that that is an issue. For example, when asked by a committee member whether the pending illegal migration bill was legal or would violate commitment to the Committee and Refugee Act, a representative from the Home Office replied, the UK illegal migration bill is compatible with the UNCRC and other international obligations. So they just say, no, it's okay, it's all compatible. Or they comment, there are no plans to review policy, for example, in relation to those aged under 16 being able to withdraw from collective worship in England, or about reviewing the age of criminal responsibility. Or that a particular practice remains legal. So in response to a question about whether use of unauthorised admissions tests by post-primary schools in Northern Ireland, a representative replied, the Department of Education does not have legal powers to end academic selection. This can only be done by the Northern Ireland Executive and an affirmative vote in Northern Ireland, an agreement about the system that might replace it. In the meantime, academic selection remains legal. So that's used as an argument for not changing something. And finally, there aren't any sanctions for non-compliance with the committee, so I'm not somebody who would normally be advocating sanctions, but I do feel like this is a very intense process that takes place over many years, and the committee makes 6 observations, and there's not really then anything that is done when state parties are not implementing rights in the way that the committee says that they should. So I think that is an issue, other than negative media coverage of their observations. Having said that, there are some positives. I do think that the committee recognises the significance of differences across UK jurisdictions. So I remember in 2008 going to the committee and they could not understand why they'd received a report from Northern Ireland, a report from Wales, a report from Scotland, a report from England. That's just the NGOs. A different report from the commissioners and then other bodies like the Human Rights Commission. They didn't understand why we couldn't just put everything together in one report and say, right, this is the issue. But actually, after attending the pre-sessional meeting, by the time they got to the government examination, they did understand the specific differences that apply in the different jurisdictions. And they were asking questions when the English representatives tend to talk about what they were doing as if that was across all the jurisdictions. The committee members started to say, well, what about what happens in Northern Ireland? What about in Scotland? So they recognise those differences. And their concluding observations really do draw out specifics for each jurisdiction where that's relevant. They've also been willing to challenge the government and devolved administrations during their examination. For example, they are very concerned about the intolerance of children and young people in the UK. In 2008, they raised a lot of questions about negative representation and demonisation of young people in the media. And they were very concerned about the introduction of antisocial behaviour orders, which they felt contributed to the early criminalisation of children. The use of mosquito devices to repel children from public spaces. These were all indicative to them of a very intolerant perception of children and young people in UK society. And in this year's examination, they continued to ask questions about public narratives about young people and actions to address negative stereotypes. In 2008, again, they focused on the poverty rate in the UK being one of the highest in Europe, and government targets to reduce poverty not being met. This year, they commented that child poverty is very high on the agenda of children and young people. They had been raising that in their meetings with the committee. And one committee member said, and I'd written this down as he said it, I'm gobsmacked by figures relating to child poverty and mental health in the UK. 1 in 4 children in poverty is very worrisome. Mental health figures also. From these, we can surmise that a lot of children are not doing well, and they consistently have raised the issue of the low age of criminal responsibility. And this year, a committee member said, the ages of criminal responsibility in UK jurisdictions are below average. The government's argument is that this brings children into the net and enables provision of support, but the committee would argue you can intervene without criminalising. And they consistently have made that argument. Another positive is that the committee identifies and develops recommendations around new or emerging issues. Some of these didn't exist when the convention was originally agreed, for example, around the digital environment and social media. Some of them gain priority during the reporting cycle, for example, different forms of violence against children, environmental concerns and gender identity. And some are about specific events, for example, Brexit, COVID, and the cost of living crisis. The committee is really well informed by the information that's provided by children, young people, civil society, NGOs, the children's commissioners, and other stakeholders. And as Paddy and Fergal have both said, during the examination, committee members were very open to lobbying, especially by the young people who attended the examination as observers. And it was very clear that their questions were influenced by meeting young people the day before the examination, and also by young people speaking to them during breaks in the actual examination. So every time there was a break, you saw all the young people who were there going and targeting committee members to ask them to raise particular issues. And then I think when they came back, it was very clear that the committee members' questions had been very influenced by the issues that young people had raised. As I was saying before, a significant amount of time and effort over at least 2 years is spent by children, young people, NGOs, civil servants to gather information as part of the process of reporting. Analysis of this information collected during this process should be informing the strategies, policies and practices of statutory agencies, the voluntary community organisations working with children and young people, policymakers and NICI. And the NGO stakeholder report evidence was based on information that was provided by NGOs about legislative and policy developments, research, consultations. There are illustrative cases, statistics, and a lot of organisational knowledge and experience has been brought together in that evidence report to provide a real overview of the state of children's rights in Northern Ireland by December 2022. The Rights Here, Rights Now report focused on the views and experiences of 1,026, very precise because it was over 1,000 and I was so delighted, as we all were, I think, 12 to 17-year-olds who responded to an online survey, and also workshops and meetings with specific groups of vulnerable and disadvantaged children and young people. And that report provides a really detailed overview of children's views and experiences. And to me, it's quite shocking the amount of dissatisfaction, really, that children are expressing around particularly their lack of participation, but also how they, the difficulties accessing services that are really relevant to them. The concluding observations should really be being used by civil servants and politicians to inform development and implementation of legislation and policy across departments, particularly the strategy for children and young people. Northern Ireland's children's strategy was really progressive in having the outcome children and young people live in a society which respects their rights. But there's not a lot of clarity about what that actually means. And for me, the concluding observations outline exactly what's required to ensure that the government and the Northern Ireland Executive fulfil their obligations under the Convention and establish such a society. They provide a clear and comprehensive framework for child rights-based approaches across all areas of children's lives for every child, and particularly the most disadvantaged.
Deena, thank you very much for that very comprehensive journey through the process, the examination itself and the concluding observations. There is a copy of Deena's presentation in your packs. What struck me in relation to it is, I suppose, the number of concluding observations, the number of urgent ones, and the number in which there's been a lack of progress over the many constructive dialogues, examinations. But the other thing that struck me as well is that the wealth of information that we have as a starting point to make a difference, not just for concluding observations. The 3 reports that went in, which are really comprehensive, they're available on the Children's Law Centre's website, and they are a benchmark. Which actually is probably, it's got worse since that, unfortunately, but they are a benchmark. We don't need to go back out again. We know what needs to be done. The information's there as a result of the information that all of you gave us, but especially to the very comprehensive work that, and excellent work that Deena did in compiling that report. So thank you very much for that, Deena. Just over 4 weeks ago, almost 100 young people from across Northern Ireland came together at Ulster University's new building in Belfast. And they came together from organisations including VOIPEC, Include Youth, Angel Eyes, the Northern Ireland Youth Forum, NICI, the Youth Assembly and Youth at CLC. And they came together to ensure that their views, experiences, wishes on a broad range of children and young people's lives are considered in the decisions about law, policy and practice that affects them. They held workshops to discuss the UN Committee's concluding observations and quizzed decision makers from the Department of Education, the Executive Office, the PSNI, as well as our new Children's Commissioner, Ms. Quinn. That was just the latest work undertaken by young people in relation to the UNCRC examination process. Over recent months and indeed years, young people have been directly involved in preparing evidence for the committee, as well as travelling to Geneva twice to meet committee members face to face and chase them down the corridors and go into the toilets after them to make sure that their voices were heard, and I'm not joking you. Those young people wanted to make sure that everyone here hears today what their views are. So in a moment, you'll see highlights of the work children and young people have been through to inform the committee and consider the concluding observations in a video which has been prepared specially for today's event. Once the video has ended, we'll hear directly from their rapporteur, Ruby Campbell. Ruby is an active member of Youth at CLC, the Children's Law Centre's Advisory Youth Panel. And earlier this year, we were delighted that she travelled with us to Geneva alongside her peers from across Northern Ireland and the UK to meet with the UN Committee to tell them what it's like to be a young person in Northern Ireland today. Ruby was at the Ulster University a few weeks ago, and we're grateful to her today for being with us, and we look forward to hearing from her. I also want to say a big shout out, hello and thank you to Matthew, who's with us today, who was also at the University of Ulster, and you'll see him shortly in the video, and he also came with us to Geneva as well. So thank you, Matthew. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Paul Hamlin Foundation, because without their support, we would not have been able to bring young people to Geneva in February and in May. And the process that we went through would be a lot poorer, and the recommendations would be a less rich had the young people not been there. And I want to, and he's going to be really embarrassed, he's going to give out to me later on, but I want to single out Paul Fenton, who's with us today. Paul works with the Paul Hamlin Foundation, and was Paul that actually made that happen. So thank you, Paul, for giving our young people a voice in Geneva. Ruby.
Change can be frustrating, especially here, especially for children and young people. We have a lot of big ideas and a whole future ahead. But despite making up a quarter of the population, we're often ignored, dismissed and let down. But we're determined to have our voice heard. Over the past year and a half, while the political institutions have been failing, Youth CLC have been raising our concerns with the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. Because when it comes to children and young people, we're the experts. We collected evidence from over 1,000 other children and young people here from all different backgrounds and submitted our report to the committee. We attended a delegation of young people to the committee not once, but twice, to give evidence and answer questions about our rights. We helped shape the committee's concluding observations and recommendations, a damning report into failures to protect and support children and young people. Now we're working to make sure the people in power fulfil their obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
My name is Matthew, and I would like to welcome you to this event, Rights Here, Rights Now. I am a young rep at Féin. Earlier this year, I travelled with young people from these organisations to Geneva.
Hi everyone, my name is Genevieve McCollum and I represented the Northern Ireland Youth Forum as an NI delegate to the UNCRC in Geneva this year.
I'm Jack Dalzell and I'm here with the Northern Ireland Youth Forum.
I also went to Geneva in February along with the Children's Law Centre.
My name's Olivia Bryson and the issue that I presented to the UN Committee was Northern Ireland's lack of government.
Everyone has to respect young people's views. No one can say that a young person's views is wrong and you're allowed to have your own opinion.
The right to be heard is just one of our rights that is set out in the UNCRC.
We're here to discuss the concluding observations and what your opinions are on the concluding observations.
Children and young people in Northern Ireland should have the chance to grow up with an effective, reliable and functional government, one that protects and promotes the rights and advocates on behalf of them.
What are you doing to ensure all young people are meeting their full potential, particularly with regard to issues like rural education and academic selection?
Withdraw the Northern Ireland budget for 2023.
We think that schools should have a National School Council policy.
RSE is a huge issue for young people.
Many young people have not been fully educated on the troubles. How can we simultaneously ensure our generation and the future generations are educated without political bias in order to ensure we can look to the future and move on?
One of the UN Committee's recommendations is to enact a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland.
Why is mental health the first thing affected by budget cuts?
What is the justification for the age of criminal responsibility?
We as young people are not being provided with a substantial government and we do not have decision makers to count on. This is entirely unacceptable.
All I really hoped for before going was that the voices of all the youth in NI were kind of heard through all of ours.
I'm so proud of myself and all the young people involved for speaking truth to power, and it's so amazing to see the impacts of young people.
Children and young people know what needs done to improve our lives. International experts agree. It's time for those in power to deliver, right here, right now.
Good morning, everyone. As you've heard earlier, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child have carefully deliberated, particularly in recent months, over vast amounts of evidence to inform their view of the quality and state of life for young people in Northern Ireland today. Most importantly, they've heard directly from the experts, young people themselves. Not just one young person, but testimony from every demographic, with unique experiences to reflect upon and views that deserve to be heard and respected. Every statement made by the committee on their concluding observations and recommendations is a direct response to the lived reality of the children and young people in our society, informed by those whose frustrations are perpetually ignored, dismissed, and diminished. Today, you need to listen. Just last month, many young people from across Northern Ireland met to share their opinions and experiences surrounding the wide range of issues affecting their lives, voicing their demands for change and linking this to the UNCRC concluding observations and recommendations published by the UN Committee in June. At this event, we expressed our disappointment surrounding the lack of progress on children's rights and the lack of a functioning government in Northern Ireland, with one young person commenting that as of July 2023, Stormont has been in a state of collapse for 41.5% of its existence. This figure will have inevitably increased over the past months. Children and young people in Northern Ireland should have the chance to grow up with an effective, reliable and functional government, one that protects and promotes their rights and advocates on behalf of them. We as young people are not being provided with a substantial government, as we do not have decision makers to count on. This is unacceptable. I myself, as I did in May at the 93rd session of the UNCRC in Geneva, voiced my shock and huge concerns relating to the staggering cuts to the education budget, which included cuts to vital resources such as free school meals, the Extended Schools programme, integrated education efforts and mental health support. I was particularly alarmed at the removal of the Extended Schools programme, which provided free breakfast for disadvantaged children. Children in Northern Ireland are coming to school hungry. This is utterly unacceptable. The event wasn't all doom and gloom, with many of us looking hopefully forward. We asked, how can we simultaneously learn from and acknowledge the past whilst building a better future? One young person said that, all I hoped was for to leave an impact on one person, because all it takes to make a positive change for all young people is to make one person in power want to make the change for us. Numerous questions for decision makers were drafted up by young people during the event. These included, young people's voices are often heard but not listened to. What happens after we're asked for our views? What can be done to tackle the negative perception of young people by the PSNI? Why are the PSNI allowed to use force on children when children should be protected? Why can't the age of criminal responsibility in Northern Ireland be raised from 10 years old, when the minimum expectation of the UNCRC is that it is 14? Young people asked, is there anything that can be done to simplify school uniforms and to stop schools from using expensive brands to support families in poverty? They also asked, could it be mandatory that school uniform retailers provide sensory-friendly items and some that are adapted to meet physical needs? They talked about seeking mental health support, but being told they didn't have severe enough problems. How can we advocate for support for young people who don't meet the threshold for CAMHS, but still need services? And how is the government going to tackle digital poverty and its impacts on education? As well as discussing the issues affecting them, young people were keen to also discuss the solutions and actions that will bring change forward. Young people asked for, amongst other things, everyone in positions of power to have a better understanding of what children's rights are and what they mean in practice. Better community facilities for young people in their local areas. More ambitious action to be taken in protecting the environment and involving young people in plans to make that happen. Support for all care leavers up to the age of 25. Training for both teachers and pupils about what living care experience means. More awareness and inclusion of different disabilities in schools. Inclusive PE sessions to ensure young people with disabilities can fully take part. The ability for young people in special schools to choose their own GCSEs. And a curriculum redesign to ensure that the curriculum more accurately reflects the needs of a 21st century student, in particular regards to RSE, mental health education, education about rights, reducing discrimination, and updating what skills young people need to be taught that reflects wider society. They ask that the examination and assessment regime in schools is redesigned to support a rounded, meaningful development of young people, not just memory. Young people asked for more safeguarding and age-appropriate restrictions when it came to social media. It was also put forward that there should be a national school council policy, with every school having a school council, which should be held accountable as part of the school inspection regime. I particularly want to ask today, in the wake of GCSE and A-level results, when is our education system going to stop prioritising academic achievement over the lives of students? We might have good exam results, but don't forget we have the highest suicide rates amongst young people in the UK. It's brilliant that students are so driven and focused on doing well in school. But when perpetual and excessive exam stress is costing thousands of us our happiness, our mental health, and ultimately our lives, what is more important? I'm asking you today, what is more important? These are just some of our issues, questions, suggestions, and solutions. A summary of the Young People's Report that was submitted to the UN Committee is included in the pack you've been given today. Read it, share it, act on it. Ultimately, children and young people in Northern Ireland care about the world around us. We want, need, and deserve things to be better. It's time for those in power to involve us and finally deliver, because we need our rights right here, right now. Thank you.
Really, thanks again for your powerful reflections and for everything you did in Geneva and when you were down in the University of Ulster. I think you are proof perfect that young people are the experts and that we need to listen to young people when we're trying to find solutions to address the very significant problems that young people are facing today. You've thrown out some huge challenges, and I had the privilege of reading your speech before today, and I am going to go back and pick out a couple of things, if you don't mind. One was that all I hoped for was to leave an impact on one person, because all it takes is for positive change for all young people to make one person in power want to make the change for us. That's a huge challenge for the MLAs here today. The other was, and this really struck with me, young people talked about seeking mental health support, but being told they weren't severe enough to be offered support. It's not an awful indictment. It's awful. It's really awful. And then the other, we might have great exam results, but don't forget we have by far the highest suicide rates among young people in the UK. Just want to leave that with you. I now am going to invite our new Children's Commissioner, Chris Quinn. I'm delighted to be able to say this. I think he's absolutely over the moon about Chris's appointment. So I'm really delighted to be able to invite Chris Quinn to give some reflections and responses to what he's heard this morning. And not just this morning, because Chris was with us in Geneva in 2015, 2016, and in February this year. And so he's well placed to reflect on this process and the importance of the UNCRC and the concluding observations. And I was looking at sort of what to say about you, Chris. I was looking at your biographies, and I learned stuff about you, even though I've known you for probably 20 years. I've learned stuff about you that I never knew. But one thing I did know was that Chris, throughout his career, has represented children and young people's interests through a rights lens. He's a real children's rights champion, and he's championed children and young people's direct participation in decision making. He was out there cheerleading the need to have young people's voices heard when there were very few doing it. He was the director of the Northern Ireland Youth Forum for 15 years, and really importantly, he's a former board member of the Children's Law Centre. We taught him all he knew. Chris is and always was a children's rights champion, and fundamental to Chris's work was supporting young people to have a say in the voices and issues that affect their lives, and ensuring their voices are heard and acted upon. Key issues Chris has worked on, and we've had the privilege of working alongside him on many of these, have included the establishment of a Northern Ireland Youth Assembly, lobbying for votes at 16, and prioritising the needs of young people who experience inequality and disadvantage. Chris, we very much welcome this reflection in response to what you've heard this morning, and more generally, the concluding observations. And not to put you on the spot, we want to know how they'll inform your work as Commissioner.
Thank you, Paddy. That was a really lovely introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here. This is week 6, I believe, in office. However, it feels like month 6 because there's so much work to be done and there's so much work that has been going on before my time in this office. So I just wanted to start by thanking CLC for having me here, for the MLAs for sponsoring this event, and for everyone that has come. I think it's a really good reflection on how important and how seriously we take children and young people's rights, and especially the young people. I'm going to start with young people's input. Ruby, that was really articulately put. I can't even say it. It was really well put, and it was a privilege to be part of that process. Actually, as Paddy says, in Geneva this year and 2 times prior to that. Matthew as well, who spoke. And Matthew was at the VoiPic event on Friday. He spoke really well at it, and I loved the reflections that I heard there about how young people from VoiPic, when they were in Geneva, didn't necessarily feel that their voices were heard, but they took it upon themselves to approach the UN rapporteurs. And Braggy, who's the chairperson now, had a really good engagement with us, I believe, and he'll be back. So yeah, I have a lot of good things to say about Braggy. But Paddy, when you were chatting earlier, I was thinking back to 1991 and 1995. I was in St Malachy's in North Belfast, 14, in 1991, and in 1995, I think I was about 16, running about the streets of North Belfast, thinking I was out Cantona, and had little to no knowledge of the UN Convention or what my rights were. So I have a real mixture of emotions as I stand here. Paradoxical feelings is what I wrote here on my notes. Was on the one hand, I feel really cross and frustrated that the stuff that Paddy and her colleagues reported to the UN Committee in '95, a lot of it still features in the concluding OBS now. I feel that we do have a perfect storm, and there are issues that I do want to touch upon with regards to where we are right now in Northern Ireland in terms of budgets, assemblies, all that kind of stuff. But I also feel very optimistic. I'm very motivated. I'm honoured to be in this role. And I'm the type of person, you can ask my parents this, or my family, or people close to me. I don't like to hear no. And sometimes that's to my detriment. I suppose at home, that was to my detriment as a child growing up. But I'm the type of person who likes to find a way through, round, or take down barriers altogether. And that's the approach that I intend adopting in my next 8 years in office. I'm really frustrated that we have systematic and endemic failures, and this has been going on for too long. I've got here in front of me, my predecessor Kula published this statement on children's rights in November 2022, and this was the 3rd statement on children's rights. And when I listened to Kula speak, all I could hear was systematic failure after systematic failure after systematic failure. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the negative impact that the budget is having on children and young people, and the NGOs in particular that serve them. Deena, you said, I think it was Deena, you said that all the answers are here. The concluding observations outline exactly what is required. And Ruby, you've said the same. You've told us, Ruby, it's time to read, share and act. That's what you said, wasn't it? And I agree with that. Page 3, if you've got a version of this in front of you, page 3, there's a couple of paragraphs I just wanted to refer to. Paragraph 11C, ensure that in situations of economic crisis, regressive measures are not taken without meeting the requirements set out in paragraph 31. So that's telling us that we ought to take into consideration the impact on children's rights in times of economic hardship. Paragraph D says very clearly, withdraw the budget for Northern Ireland for the period 23-24. So the UN Committee have seen this. Young people told them. You told them in May, Ruby, this budget isn't serving our needs. The UN Committee have responded very clearly to say that this budget needs withdrawn. I would argue very strongly, and it's well versed, that the Northern Ireland budget is adversely affecting young people's rights. I would ask all government departments to have another look at each of their budgets. Look at your equality impact assessments and look at it through the lens of child rights and age, because I do feel that sometimes gets overlooked. I think the voices of children and young people are absolutely important in all of this. And the reason I went back to 1991 and 1995, when I was a teenager growing up, and in fact, looking through the lens of a parent, I have 4 children, a 4-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 9-year-old. And I can hand on heart say that if it hadn't have been for the line of work that I'm in, that those children wouldn't know anything about the UN Convention. And when I visit schools and I ask children, do they know about my role? Most children don't. Most children don't know the language of rights, and most children don't know what the UN Convention is. We need to find a way to communicate with children about their rights. We need to look at the visibility of my office and of this convention. We need to look at accessibility. Is this language that we're all using accessible to children, particularly those most vulnerable? And then young people have said time and time again, I've been to the UN Committee 3 times, and children and young people always say knowledge of rights. Knowledge of rights is huge. You don't know what you don't know, right? So if I don't know what my rights are, I cannot exercise them. And there are many examples that I could give standing here. One that I'm thinking about is the rights of young people who are housed in vulnerable situations, and the UN Committee have recognised this as well, and they've said that we ought to do more to prevent homelessness. I think we've a bit of work to do, but a lot of these goals are achievable. The things that Ruby and Matthew and their peers have asked for aren't big asks, and that's why I feel optimistic. The slide that Deena had in front of us earlier, specific to Northern Ireland, they're not big asks. In my opinion, we can achieve them. And yes, we have no government, and we have to call that out. But we do have a civil service. We have permanent secretaries who are willing to work with us. And we do have a Children's Services Cooperation Act. And I just want to reflect on that for a moment. My opinion on that act is that it's sitting there dormant at the minute. It passed through this Assembly in 2015. And on paper, it tells us that government departments and duty bearers should all work together. And in the back of that act, they're listed. You know, all of these public bodies are listed. So it's there. We need to work across departments. We need to work across public bodies. We need to look at how we resource all of this work. And in particular, I have a huge bias, and I think it's a healthy one, towards the voluntary sector. We need to look at how we support the voluntary sector in all of this. Because working year on year, month on month, on budgeting just doesn't work. And our NGO sector are picking up the pieces where often statutory bodies can't or won't. So there's a big onus on how we budget for all of this. I'm just keeping an eye on time because I am passionate about this. I have a lot to say. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about what I'm going to do about this. What are we going to do about this? So I stand here, I feel very privileged, as I says to you, growing up in North Belfast in the 90s, pre-Good Friday Agreement, going to university wasn't even in my wildest dreams. You know, education system didn't really work for me. My education started in the community when I volunteered in a local community centre and learnt about social justice. I learnt about rights. I learnt about community development. That's where it all started taking off for me. And that little fire in my belly started to light. And I can see people like Ruby and like Matthew and like others that little fire is lighting in their bellies. So I feel really honoured to stand here, actually. And the difference between me now than in the 90s is that I have the honour to have an international human rights instrument in my armoury, and I intend using that as best as I can. I'm obliged to take action on the concluding obs. I'm obliged to report back to the UN Committee, and I also have duties with regards to our local assembly and holding government to account, intervening where rights aren't being met, and I fully intend on using those rights. My predecessor, Kula, and her predecessors done excellent work in terms of this office, and I intend on raising the bar even higher. The concluding obs will feature in my day-to-day work. I, at the moment, am formulating a corporate plan which will inform my work for the next 4 years, and I would really encourage people that are here to feed into that. what I've tried to do, if any of you follow me on Twitter, I've tried to get out to speak to as many young people as possible and to the people that work with them. That's a huge part of my role. I'm a huge advocate for Article 12 and the voices of young people. I've spent my career trying to champion the voice of young people, and I'll continue to do that. So it's my intention through our corporate plan to implement whatever I can in the concluding observations and work closely with government in ensuring that change does happen, because it's not acceptable. It's really not acceptable that we still are talking about things like the transfer test. What else? I'm trying to think of things that are still in there, but there are a litany of recommendations within this report that were in the last report and the one prior to that. So it's time for action. I don't want to take up this office and go into rooms and do speeches like this and just all the words. If you remember, Greta Thunberg, I think, said no more blah blah blah. So I'm going to steal her words. No more blah blah blah. Let's work. This is where the work starts for me. I was at the event in the university. I have been part of the process with young people. They found the engagement in the UN very, very meaningful, and it's our job now. I'm looking to everyone in this audience to think, what will I do? Let's look in the mirror here. Let's look in the mirror and see how can we make a difference to children and young people's rights. Read, share, act, as Ruby had said. And I also wanted just to say, it's time, I'm going to quote you again, Ruby, it's time for those in powers to deliver right here, right now. And I'm just going to echo those words. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris, for your thoughtful reflections. I have taken a note of what you promised to do. So you have to take account of the UNCRC. You're going to hold government to account. You're going to intervene. You're going to raise the bar higher, and your concluding observations will feature strongly in your strategic plan, and you make sure change happens. Children's Law Centre will be honoured to work with you in that journey as you hold government to account in relation to the concluding observations. So folks, I just want to conclude today's proceedings reflecting a little bit on what we heard this morning. We know what the problems are. You've heard it today. There are 3 comprehensive reports available. You have available the concluding observations from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which are damning. You know, the urgent ones, the repeat offenders, the ones that are specific to this jurisdiction. As Fergal said, the convention and the concluding observations are not the high bar, they're the floor, they're the minimum standards that we have to adhere to, and we're not doing it. But we've also heard about some ways through it, and I think there is a framework there, and I'm going back to something Danny said at the start, which I think is key, and it is, if you know the problem well, you're halfway to dealing with it, and I think that is key. And that speaks to the importance of data collection, as Danny referenced it well. It speaks to the issue of child impact assessments and the importance of that as well, demonstrated when you look at the appalling budget and the impact of children and young people in this jurisdiction. Both Danny and Chris mentioned the importance of the Children's Services Cooperation Act. It's not been implemented. It's a statutory duty and it's not been implemented. And if it was being implemented, the experience of young people and children in this jurisdiction will be very different. So maybe the MLAs could take that away with them, and hopefully in a soon-to-be restored government, they'll actually ensure that effect is given to that important piece of legislation. The very strong message, I think, from everybody today is the importance of young people's voices. They're the experts, and if you want to solve a problem, you go to the experts. You find out what the problem is, but critically, as Ruby's pointed out, and all the other young people who've been part of this process pointed out, they also have some solutions that we need to take seriously, and we need to engage with them and tease out. We need to communicate, Chris, you're right. We need to communicate with children about their rights, and knowledge of their rights is key. If you don't know what your rights are, how can you actually claim them? And we see that again and again in the Children's Law Centre. when we're trying to support children and young people to claim their rights. And Chris, I think you pointed out something as well that's really critical, is the importance of support for the community and voluntary sector. They are critical in protecting children and young people, providing them with that advice, making them aware of their rights, and that needs to be looked at urgently as well. We are at the start of a new conversation. It's not the start of the conversation, we've been having it since 1995, but this is a new conversation. We've new opportunities. The Children's Law Centre, and I know other community and voluntary sector organisations in this room are up for that conversation. They're willing to have that conversation with you and work with you to give effect to the concluding observations. We're, as part of that process, the Children's Law Centre are bringing Bragi Goodhansen, who was head of the task force that led the examination of the UK government, later this month to Belfast, and hopefully some of you will attend his lecture down in the Old Bar Library and get the chance to meet him. We will continue that work with you all into the forthcoming months and years ahead. Before I finish, I want to mention two things very briefly, two advertisements in the Children's Law Centre, and I mention them because I get killed if I don't mention them. Firstly is there's a list, Children's Law Centre are after a hiatus, we are relaunching our training, and there's a list of the training events in your packs. And there's also a Children's Law Centre membership form in your packs as well. And if you become a member of the Children's Law Centre, you get reduced costs for the training events, so that's a big incentive. Before I invite you to join us for some lunch and to continue the conversation, I just want to leave you again with Ruby's words, which are really powerful, and it's probably going to be the takeaway from this morning. It is, read it, share it, act on it. Thank you very much.